Welcome to another episode where we look at history and culture through the lens of beer.
Ah, yes.
Today, we're cracking open a scientific paper
Okay.
from FIMO's yeast research
Yeah.
to explore the origins of lager yeast.
Oh, yes, the mighty Saccharomyces pastorianus, the workhorse behind all those crisp, clean lagers we love.
Exactly. But, when I first saw the title, I was like, uh-oh, lager yeast, Saccharomyces pastorianus, the brewing yeast. I'll admit, I thought this is going to be dense.
I get it. Scientific papers, they can be intimidating, but trust me, this one is a real page-turner.
Well, you've convinced me. Okay, so what's the big takeaway?
Well, this paper digs into historical records to try to solve a real yeast mystery. How did lager yeast, specifically S. pastorianus, actually come to be?
That is a mystery. I mean, well, we all know ales are top fermenting, thanks to S. cerevisiae,
Wow.
and lagers are bottom fermenting because of S. pastorianus. Isn't that pretty straightforward?
You'd think so, but historically it wasn't always so clear-cut. See, before brewers had access to pure yeast cultures, they used something called Stellhefen.
Stellhefen. That sounds like something out of a Tolkien novel.
It does have a certain ring to it, right? But basically it just means they were using a mix of different yeasts, kind of like a wild yeast party in their brew. And get this, the temperature played a huge role in how those yeasts fermented, not just the yeast itself.
So you're telling me a brewer could use the same mix of yeasts, but just by changing the temperature, they could get a completely different style of beer.
That's the idea. This paper has all these fascinating examples, like imagine a world where there are actual laws against bottom-fermenting yeasts.
Wait, seriously, they outlawed certain types of yeast?
Yep. Back in medieval times, some cities had brewing ordinances banning bottom-fermenting yeast because they were worried about brewers messing up the traditional beer styles. They wanted to keep things consistent, you know?
Wow, that's intense. I guess quality control is a big deal even back then.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the law. The paper talks about this crazy dispute between bakers and brewers in Munich back in 1483. Apparently, the brewer's bottom-fermenting yeast was terrible for baking bread.
So there was competition for good yeast even back then. I love it.
Oh, yeah. Good yeast was a hot commodity. And get this. There are even 16th century brewing manuals that describe how a top fermentation could spontaneously switch to a bottom fermentation in the barrels just because of the conditions.
Whoa! So sometimes it wasn't even about the yeast itself, but more about the environment it was in. It's like the yeast was saying, hey, it's cold down here, let's switch things up.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole story so fascinating. It challenges this simple idea that bottom fermentation automatically means S. pastorianus was involved. Clearly, there was something else going on, something that led to the emergence of this unique hybrid yeast.
Okay, so how do we get from these wild yeast mixes to the S. pastorianus we know and love today? Is there another character in this story?
There is. Enter Saccharomyces eubayanus, the mysterious parent from a faraway land.
Ooh, intrigue. Tell me more.
Well, S. eubayanus is this cold-tolerant species. And get this, it was originally found in Patagonia.
Patagonia, as in the tip of South America. That's a long way from Germany.
I know, right? But it's been popping up in other unexpected places too, like Tibet and Ireland, although it's still super rare.
So how did this South American yeast make its way into European lager? Does it hitch a ride on a ship or something?
That's the million-dollar question. The prevailing theory was that S. eubayanus somehow made its way to Europe and had a chance encounter with S. cerevisiae, which led to the creation of S. pastorianus.
Kind of a yeast Romeo and Juliet story.
Haha, sort of. But this paper proposes a different take. Something they call the Hofbräuhaus hypothesis.
Hold on. Hofbräuhaus. Like the famous beer hall in Munich.
The one and only.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does the Hofbräuhaus have to do with the origin of lager yeast?
Well, their idea is that maybe it wasn't about S. eubayanus traveling all the way to Europe. Maybe, just maybe, it was about a specific strain of S. cerevisiae already in Europe ending up in the right place at the right time. And that place was the Hofbräuhaus.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. Spill the tea. What happened at the Hofbräuhaus?
Get this. The historical records from the early 17th century line up perfectly with the genetic timeline for when S. pastorianus is believed to have emerged, which is somewhere between 1550 and 1800. And during that time, there were two major events at the Hofbräuhaus that could have set the stage for this whole yeast love story.
Ooh, two major events. This is better than a soap opera.
Right. So in 1602, the Duke of Bavaria decided to bring a wheat beer brewery and all its yeasts from a place called Schwarzach to the Hofbräuhaus. Now, before that, the Hofbräuhaus was primarily known for brewing this brown beer, which was bottom fermented.
So you've got these new yeasts coming into a place already using bottom-fermenting techniques.
Interesting. Right. And then just to spice things up even more, in 1612, the Duke hired a brewer from Einbeck to work at the Hofbräuhaus.
And Einbeck was known for.
Their top fermented ales.
Wait a minute, so now you've got wheat beer yeast from Schwarzach, ale yeast from Einbeck, and the original bottom-fermenting yeasts all under one roof at the Hofbräuhaus.
Yeah.
It's like a yeast melting pot.
Exactly. This scenario basically sets the stage for a potentially unique hybridization event. It's like all the right ingredients, literally were in the right place at the right time.
It's mind-blowing to think that our beloved lager yeast might have been born out of this historical coincidence. But how did this Munich-born yeast go from a single brewery to conquering the world? Did they have, like, traveling yeast salesmen back then?
Not quite traveling salesmen, but there were definitely some key figures who helped spread the lager love. One of the most important was a guy named Gabriel Sedlmayr the Elder.
Sedlmayr. That name rings a bell.
He was a legendary brewer who actually worked at the Hofbräuhaus for a while and later owned the Spaten brewery. And Spaten became famous for their lager.
Ah, Spaten. Okay, now it's all coming together. So how did this guy Sedlmayr help spread the lager yeast?
Well, he was known for being incredibly generous with his knowledge and his yeasts. He was happy to share his secrets with other brewers.
So Sedlmayr was like the Johnny Appleseed of lager yeast.
Yeah.
Going around planting the seeds, or in this case the yeasts, for a new kind of beer.
Exactly. And there's this great story from 1845 about J.C. Jacobsen, the founder of Carlsberg Brewery.
Oh, yeah.
He traveled all the way from Copenhagen to Munich to get his hands on some of that Spaten yeast. And get this, he carried it back to Denmark in a tin can.
A tin can. Talk about dedication. I hope you had a backup.
Right. But this was still before pure yeast cultures were a thing. So it wasn't just about the yeast itself. It was about sharing the entire brewing process, that unique Stelhofen mix that Sedlmayr had perfected.
Like sharing a sourdough starter. It's a whole ecosystem.
Exactly. But then towards the end of the 1800s, everything changed thanks to two pioneers, Emil Christian Hansen and Paul Lindner.
Weren't they the guys who figured out how to isolate pure yeast strains, like separating the wheat from the chaff, or in this case, the S. pastorianus from everything else?
You got it. And that discovery was a total game changer for brewing.
Okay, I need the backstory here. How did they even figure out they could isolate pure yeast strains?
Well, it all started at Carlsberg Brewery. Remember how Jacobsen brought that precious Spaten yeast all the way back to Copenhagen?
Yeah, in his trusty tin can.
Right. Well, Carlsberg was doing really well with that Spaten yeast, but then they decided to start brewing year-round.
Ambitious. I bet that put a lot of stress on their yeast supply.
It did, and that's when they started having problems with consistency and spoilage. So they brought in Emil Christian Hansen to figure out what was going on.
Smart move. Carlsberg was like, we need a yeast whisperer, stat.
Pretty much.
Oh.
And Hansen delivered. In 1883, he managed to isolate a pure culture of S. pastorianus from that Carlsberg yeast, which originally came from Spaten, remember?
So he was basically purifying the S. pastorianus from that wild mix.
Exactly. And it turned out that the Carlsberg yeast actually contained several different yeasts. Only one of them was the true workhorse, the one consistently producing good lager. The others were what they called wild yeasts back then.
So all this time, brewers had been unknowingly working with a team of yeasts. And Hansen was the one who figured out how to draft the all-star player.
Precisely. And while Hansen was working his magic at Carlsberg, over in Berlin, Paul Lindner was also busy isolating pure yeast cultures.
Two brilliant minds tackling the same problem from different angles. That's amazing.
It is. Lindner developed a technique called Tröpfchenkultur, which basically involved isolating single yeast cells under a microscope.
Wow, talk about painstaking work. That's some serious dedication to yeast.
I know, right? But both Hansen and Lindner's discoveries opened up a whole new world for brewers. They made it possible to brew with pure single-strain yeasts, which meant brewers could finally control their beers like never before.
No more wild yeast parties.
Well, some brewers still love those, but now they have the option to go for consistency and predictability.
It must have been a revelation for brewers to be able to work with such precision. No more relying on those unpredictable Stelhamen mixes.
Exactly. And as these pure cultures became more widely available, researchers started noticing something interesting. There were distinct variations even within S. pastorianus.
So even within this one species of lager yeast, there was diversity.
Yes. And that diversity led to the identification of two main groups of S. pastorianus, Group 1 and Group 2, which brewers often call Saaz and Frohberg.
Ah, yes. Saaz and Frohberg. I've seen those names on some craft beer labels, but I never knew what they actually meant. So what's the difference between these two groups?
It all comes down to their fermentation characteristics and ultimately their genetics. The Saaz group, or Group I, are slow fermenting yeasts known for producing really clean, crisp beers.
So Saaz is the yeast behind those super crisp pilsners I love.
You got it. They're known for their ability to ferment at very low temperatures and for their high attenuation.
Attenuation. Refresh my memory on what that means.
Basically, it refers to how much of the sugar in the wort the yeast converts into alcohol. Saaz yeasts are very efficient, so they produce beers that are dry and crisp.
Got it. Clean, crisp, and efficient. That's Saaz in a nutshell. What about Frohberg then?
Frohberg, or Group 2, yeasts are a bit different. They're faster fermenters, and they don't flocculate as much, which means they stay suspended in the beer longer.
Flocculate.
It basically means clumping together. So because Frohberg yeasts don't clump as readily, they tend to produce beers that are a bit fuller-bodied and have a slightly more complex flavor profile.
So Saaz is like the marathon runner. Slow and steady, while Frohberg is more like a sprinter. Fast and intense.
That's a great analogy. And interestingly, these two groups have slightly different genetic makeups as well. Saaz yeasts are typically triploid, which means they have 3 sets of chromosomes, while Frohberg yeasts are tetraploid with 4 sets.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. So this difference in the number of chromosome sets, is that what causes their different fermentation characteristics?
It definitely plays a role. The extra set of chromosomes in Frohberg yeast likely gives them a bit more genetic flexibility, which could be why they're able to ferment faster and produce a wider array of flavor compounds.
It's amazing how much we've learned about this humble little organism. We've gone from these mixed Stelhiffen cultures to the isolation of pure S. pastorianus strains. And now we're even talking about distinct groups within that species.
It's incredible how much complexity there is within the world of yeast.
But I'm curious, how did we go from those early isolates of Saaz and Frohberg to the huge variety of lager yeast strains available today?
That's where things get really exciting. Once brewers and scientists had access to pure yeast cultures, it opened up a whole new realm of possibilities.
So they started experimenting, like mad scientists in the lab, but with yeast instead of bubbling concoctions.
Mad yeast scientists, exactly. They could start experimenting with different strains, crossing them, and selecting for specific traits, kind of like breeding dogs or plants.
It's a great analogy. Just like we've bred different dog breeds for different purposes, we've bred different yeast strains for different brewing outcomes. Some brewers want a yeast that produces a super clean, crisp pilsner, while others might want a yeast that creates a more complex, fruity lager.
Right.
And now we're seeing this explosion of craft breweries experimenting with all sorts of unique lager yeasts, like the Wild West of lager brewing out there.
I know, it's a great time to be a lager lover. And this whole story about the origins of S. pastorianus really highlights how interconnected different yeast species are. Remember how we talked about S. eubayanus, that cold-tolerant species from Patagonia?
Right, the other half of the lager yeast equation.
Well, it turns out that S. pastorianus is just one example of a hybrid yeast. There are many other hybrids out there, some naturally occurring and some created in the lab, that brewers are using to make all sorts of interesting beers.
So this hybridization thing, this blending of different yeast species, is more common than we might think.
Absolutely. And it's something that brewers are increasingly exploring as they search for new flavors and ways to push the boundaries of what beer can be.
It makes you wonder what other yeast hybrids are out there, waiting to be discovered or even created. What other brewing secrets might these tiny organisms be holding?
That's what's so exciting about yeast research. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible with these amazing little creatures.
Before we wrap up, I'm still curious about Saaz and Frohberg. Besides the number of chromosome sets, are there any other key genetic differences between them?
Yes, quite a few actually. There are differences in genes that control all sorts of things, like how they take in and use sugar, how they flocculate, and even what kinds of flavor compounds they produce.
So even though they're both S. pastorianus, they've got their own unique genetic toolboxes, so to speak.
Exactly. And those differences are what make them so interesting to brewers. Saaz yeasts are typically used for those classic crisp pilsners and Helles lagers, while Frohberg yeasts can handle a bit more complexity and are often used for styles like Märzen, Dunkel, and Box.
It's amazing to think that these tiny little organisms can have such a huge impact on the final product. It's not just about the ingredients, the water, or the brewing process. The yeast is really the unsung hero of lager brewing.
I couldn't agree more. It's the yeast that ultimately determines the beer's character, its flavor profile, and its drinkability.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the mysterious origins of lager yeast to the complex genetics that make each strain unique.
It's been a fascinating journey through the world of Saccharomyces pastorianus.
Absolutely. And I think it's safe to say that this humble little yeast has played an outsized role in shaping beer history and culture. So next time you raise a glass of your favorite lager, take a moment to appreciate the amazing journey that brought that beer to your lips.
Cheers to that.
Cheers. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this exploration of lager yeast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories about history and culture, all told through the lens of beer. Until next time, cheers.